Creating the geometry for a model is only half of the battle. The other half involves creating the surfaces that go on those geometric faces. In this tutorial, we are going to learn the basics of using PBR materials in Blender. So let's jump right into it. So I've opened Blender and I have the 3-division default cube here in my scene. If you want access to this default cube that comes with a few starter materials, geometry node setups for scattering, and other goodies hidden in, then be sure to click the link in the description. For now though, I'm just going to disable this entire collection so that we don't have to see it, and I will begin by adding a cube and a sphere, and then I'm going to shade this sphere smooth. Now I'm sure you've created a material before, but I'm going to do it right here by clicking my material properties panel and then hitting new on that button, and we're going to call this material, let's do matte demo for material demo. And then I'm just going to change this base color by clicking on this big color square, and let's pull it down something into the orange direction. And that looks pretty good. Now let's select this other one as well, and I'm going to click this little drop down this time, find matte demo, left click to select it, and now we have our material on both of these objects. Let's switch over to our shading editor window. That way we have the shading editor here, and I've got it set up so my shader editor is on my left and my viewport on my right. And let's take a look at both of these. I'm going to switch to rendered view. I'm in Eevee and I have ray tracing on, but I'm going to turn that off so that we don't have to worry about the noise right now. And then we're going to go over here and take a look at this Principled BSDF node in this shader window. Now you've probably seen this before, and I just want to walk really quickly through how this works. A shader is a collection of code that tells the computer how to render a given pixel of an object based on where it sits in the scene, how the light is interacting with it, and so on. Now, the most basic aspect of our shader is the color. That's what tells Blender what color is this object. Now you can see as it's rendering, there is this light white color around the edge. This isn't just pure color. This is instead coded color. So for instance, with the same process of adding an object over here, I'm going to, with my left mouse button there, hit Shift and A, and then I'm going to search for RGB. And we've got color here. And then I'm going to just drag this color that we have there and pop it onto here, and then drag this color socket straight into the surface. And now you can see that it is not interacting with the light whatsoever. There are no calculations happening about how the light and the scene should interact with this color. It's only that color. If I plug this BSDF back in, then now you see we get our reflections. Okay, so that's how a shader works, or just a simple description of what a shader is, rather. Now, we have the base color. We've already played with that a little bit, but then we have this metallic slider. Now, an object is either typically metallic or it is not. So if I pop metallic up, you can see that it looks a little different. It looks metallic, and though it's not the kind of thing that we can pinpoint exactly what that look is in terms of our own descriptions, we can definitely see that this doesn't look metallic and this does, and that's because of the way that the reflections are handled with metallic objects. And speaking of reflections, this value for roughness simply describes how rough or how smooth the surface of an object is. If it is perfectly rough, it's not going to be reflecting light in any kind of unified way. It's what would be called perfectly diffuse. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you have the surface of the object here, and let's say that this surface is bumpy, so we've got a bunch of micro bumps all over it. It's almost like sandpaper. When a light ray comes down and bounces off of this surface, it's going to bounce in a direction based on where it hits, right? And based on the angle of the object that it's hitting. So on this peak, it might bounce off in this perpendicular direction, but then you've got another ray of light coming down here that hits this on the side and bounces back, and then the next one may hit this piece and then bounce off there. And you can see what I mean. If it's a perfectly rough surface, that means that basically no rays of light are being bounced off in a similar direction and you don't have any reflections. However, if you have a perfectly smooth object like this one, and the light comes down and bounces off of it, it's going to bounce off at a perpendicular angle, and the next one is going to bounce off of it at exactly the same perpendicular angle, and you get reflections. So if I were to make this perfectly smooth, we get a perfect reflection of the HDRI that is currently lighting up this scene. Okay, so that's what the roughness describes on the surface of our object. I'm going to bump this up to something like, let's do 0.25. And of course, you can left click here in any of these values and type in the value manually. The IOR has to do with the way light bends as it passes through an object. We're not going to talk about that in too much detail right now. Alpha has to do with how transparent the object is. So here at 0, you can't see it because the shader is not showing any of it. And then here in the mid-range, you can see that we have transparency existing in our object. It's basically, is the object on or off? This normal socket doesn't have any values for you to adjust here, and that's because right now the current value is 0. Now you have to plug in a normal map to this socket in order for there to be normal data being used, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. I want to pop into just a couple of these other ones. We're not going to walk through all of them. Specular specifically just has to do with how the reflections are being handled. So you can see we've got these reflections there, but if I adjust the IOR level, the strength of those reflections changes. And this can be really handy for handling some tricky bits in materials later. Transmission has to do with light passing through an object. If I pop this up, you can see it looks like this object has light passing through it, but this is kind of a fake effect in Eevee. It's not exactly working like you would expect. If we switch to cycles though, then you would see that it actually is trying to calculate some of these light rays passing through it, and we bump the roughness down and you get something like a glass shader. I'm going to bump back to Eevee though, pull the roughness back up, turn the transmission down, and then I want to show you this coat. So right now you can see our roughness is as let's bump it up to 0.35. Not very rough. We don't have a very good reflection here. But if I take this coat and I turn the weight all the way up, well, now you can see that we have reflections showing up of the outer HDRI, and that's because this coat that has been put on top also has reflective properties as well. It's like the coating on the clear coat on wood or the clear coat on a car's surface. That's basically what the coat idea is mimicking. Let's pull that back down, and then I want to show you sheen. We can just show you real quick kind of what it looks like. You can see how it's adding almost like a dust layer. There's a lot of really interesting things you can do there, but I'm not going to talk more about that right now. The emission is another one you're going to use quite often. Let's bump it up to something like 5, and you can see now we are emitting light from the surfaces. If I left click and drag and drop that orange color, now we're emitting orange light. Now you can't really see any light being emitted. If I add a mesh plane, move it down, scale it up, still nothing because we have so much light. I'm going to go to my HDRI. I'm going to turn the value down to 0 so that we have no other light in the scene. But even though these are lit up, they're not casting light. And that's because in Eevee, light is not cast by these objects unless you turn on ray tracing. And now you can see there is some light being cast. Now it's still weird. You've got some issues here that you're going to have to fix if you're going to use this and try to actually do something within your scene. But if you go into cycles, you can see that the light is casting down below the box just like it should, and everything is pretty cool. This is a great way to get light in your scene and use objects for lighting, and you can do some, pretty cool things with the emissive lights. I'm going to turn it down to 0 though. We're going to bump our HDRI back up to 1 so that we can see what we're doing, and I'm going to delete that plane. Now, with one more thing, this thin film, just so you know what it is, thin film is going to give you a kind of oily substance look. You can use noise textures to drive that kind of look that you get on a bubble or on an oil spill in water, that sort of thing. Now, when we're creating textures, we don't just want simple textures like this. We want to replicate real-world surfaces like ground or concrete or tile or porcelain, ceramic, that sort of thing. We want these to look real. One of the easiest and most direct ways to do that is with what are called PBR textures, or physically based renders of image textures. Now, in order to use these, you need to acquire the image maps that are necessary for this system. Now, I'm going to show you something called Polyhaven. You need to go to this website, polyhaven.com, support it if you can, but it gives you free textures, HDRIs, models for you to download and use in your objects. They are 100% free. You can use them without any restrictions. It's an amazing site, and a lot of incredibly generous people working on these. So I'm going to go to Browse Textures, and I used a couple from this site. So I used one called brown_mud leaves. There we go, brown mud leaves, if you want to grab the exact one that I'm using. And then I got another one called rocks ground 01, and there it is right there, rocks ground 01. These are the two textures that I downloaded. So if you select them, then you can see you've got this option to download, and you can get this 4K. You can change your resolution. You can change what kind of file you're downloading. I suggest just using Blender. I'll show you how to use that here in just a minute. And then you can go ahead and exit out of that. And then you're going to want to know where on your computer you have saved those particular files. One more thing you have to do before we keep moving on this particular tutorial is that you need to make sure that the Blender add-on called Node Wrangler is enabled. So I'm going to go to Preferences up here in my system, go to Add-ons, and then search for the Node Wrangler. ensure that that checkbox is ticked because you are going to want to use this now and forever. Now, when you're in your shader editor here, with that Principled BSDF shader selected, you can hit Control Shift and T, and it will bring up this dialog box asking you where you want to navigate and what you want to bring in. So I've got the rocks ground and the brown mud leaves. So I'm going to double click this rocks ground. You can see we have this blend file right here. I'll talk about the blend file with the other one in just a moment, but I want you to pop into this textures folder, and you can see now that we have 4 different image textures available to us. This first one is a color map. The second one is a displacement map. That's what the SP stands for. This one is for a normal map, and this last one is for a roughness map. So let's select all of those, and then now you can see this Principled Texture Setup button. I'm going to hit enter or click it, and look at that. We have this beautiful texture of rocks and some sticks and some dirt here. Really, really cool stuff. Actually, I'm going to, since we're doing ground, I'm going to go ahead and delete these objects, and I'm going to add a plane, and then go over here to my materials and select the one we just had called Demo Matte. Matte Demo, that's the one. And there we go. We have a really nice looking surface of rocks. Now let me walk you through what we've got over here in this window. The first thing we have on the far left is the texture coordinates of the object that we've applied the material to, and that is the UV coordinates. So we are using the object's UV maps to drive where on the geometry the material is appearing. That goes through a mapping node, and this allows us to adjust where things sit. So I could change the rotation and the whole thing stretches. And that's because of how it's all set up. If I change the Z rotation, though, you can see it rotates kind of as you would expect. I'm actually going to switch to material preview. Let's go to rendered mode, but let's go to Eevee and turn off ray tracing. That way we can kind of see this in a little faster view. So if I change this, you can see it's rotating down here around this corner. Okay. So I'm just going to hit backspace over here with my mouse hovering over it to reset it. And then of course you can change the location, kind of where it sits on the object, and you can change the scale. And if you left click and drag, you can change that scale together and begin to scale the whole thing up. I could scale it up times 50 if I wanted to. And now it's multiplied all over the surface of the object many, many times. And you can see the macro pattern here. But let's just go ahead and change that back to normal. Up here we have the base color, and you can see that the base color map is being plugged into our base color of the shader. If we Control and Shift and left click with that Node Wrangler add-on enabled, I can see only that map. Basically, we're pumping it straight out of the shader, no light interaction, just the color. And I'm going to do that with a roughness map, and you can see that we've got these white and black values that are telling us how shiny or how rough the object is supposed to be. If I Control Shift left click on the displacement, then you'll see the white areas stand for higher parts of the map, the black for more depressed, and that's how we're going to drive displacement here in a minute when I show you how to do that. And then there's this normal map, and I'm going to walk you through how this works because this is pure 3D magic right here. I'm going to grab what's called a separate RGB node. Separate, actually it's called separate color there. And then I'm going to zoom in down here. If I click and drag from this color and plug that color value into the separate color, now we're going to look at the red, green, and blue channels of this object. So if I Control Shift left click, then we'll be at red. I can switch to green and then blue, and if I just keep left clicking, it'll cycle through them. So let's start with red. Now you can see these rocks here, but notice something about this rock right here. Where's the shadow? It's on this side, which means the light is coming from this direction. Control Shift left click again. Now look what's changed. We've got the shadow down there, the light coming from this direction. You can see the shadow and shadow and shadow. Now on this last one, Control Shift left click, then what we see is the light is basically coming from directly above. Like there's not really a shadow cast in any particular direction. Now what Blender does, what 3D programs do with this normal information is it takes it as non-color data, plugs it into this normal map, and then into our shader, and now what we get is fake detail. So when we're down here at the edge, it almost looks like this is real. Now you might say, I don't really see that. Well, that's because of the way this scene is set up right now. So let me actually show you some light. I'm going to turn that off, and then I'm going to add a light in here. Add a point light, grab it and move it up here, something like this, and let's change the value of our point light to something like 50. Oh, we need maybe even more. Oh, that's not more. That's back to 10. 100. There we go. Now, whoa, why is this looking so weird? Something is fishy about this one. Normal map, maybe I need to go down a little bit. Yeah, there we go. That's probably why our normal map is just a little too strong. But watch what's happening. this scene, these rocks are actually interacting with the light. So you can see the shadow is over here. When I move the light this way, then now the light is casting a shadow on this side. And so it looks like this is a detailed object, but when I switch into my solid mode, this is a plane with 4 vertices. That's all. So this is really, really cool stuff. And it allows us to have detail at low computational cost. Now, if you want real detail in this scene, we can do that with the displacement map. So I'm going to go over here to my material setting, and we have to turn on displacement. Now, you might think that as you're scrolling down here, so you've got this surface that is the Principled BSDF shader. Basically, all those options are the same as our shader. The displacement, you might think, is where you'd go to turn it on. However, the displacement is simply another representation of this node right there. So what you want to do is skip this node, go down here to settings, and then there's this option here for your displacement. Right now it's set to bump only, which means it's using only the normal map. Now what we can do is switch to displace only, and now it's going to displace the object. And it's definitely displaced something, but it's not displaced what we want. It's actually displaced the average across those 4 vertices, which means that it's not doing its job. And that's because what we need is actually to have more detail in our mesh in order for the geometry to be displaced. So I'm going to tab in edit mode, right click on this mesh. Let's get this face, subdivide. And I'm going to subdivide this by a factor of, let's say, 50. And now you can see that since we have more vertices, for the displacement map to push, it's pushing and pulling them. Now we want more detail than even this. So I'm going to go over here, now that I've subdivided it, add another subdivision surface modifier. I'm going to bump that up to 2. And now we have even more detail, but it's obviously way too powerful. So let's go over here to our displacement options. And I'm going to scale this at 0.1, and that might even still be a little bit big, 0.05. And then I'm going to go back over here. Let's turn that off again. Let's add an area light. Grab this and rotate it so that we can see. Now you can see we have the same kind of effect, like the light is interacting with the surface, but now the surface actually has geometric detail. You can see that bump of a rock sticking up over there. You can see all the little kind of details popping out here in our scene. And if we had an even higher resolution displacement map, you could have even more details. In fact, there's another type of displacement that allows for even you to get the curvature underneath these kind of objects with VDB displacement. And that's a different thing, and we'll talk about it some other time perhaps, but not this tutorial. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at another way to bring in a PBR setup to our scene. So this time what we did was we built our own material. We added all of these image textures to our Principled BSDF so that we could have this material in our scene. But what I want to do this time is bring in a Finder window. So I've got in my Finder this particular window right here that has our brown mud and leaves and the rocks in the ground. So we've got the rocks ground. I want to get the brown mud leaves in here. So we're going to pop this open, and you can see that I've got this blend file right here called brown mud leaves 01 4K. Now if I click and drag that from my system folder into the viewport, you can see that I get a couple of options. Now they disappeared. I can either open it, and what that will do is open this blend file in the place of the one I have open now. It'll close down the existing one and pop open this one. If I hit link, then what that does is it creates a link between this blend file that I have started now and the one here on my computer. If I click append, then what that will do is copy information from this blend file on my computer into the blend file that I currently have open in Blender, and that's exactly what I want to do. Click append, and now you see that we have access to different pieces of information from this blend file. I can look for an object, and you can see there's some information here, some lights, there's a sphere, there's a plane. I don't want any objects though. What I want is the material, and that is right here. There it is, brown mud leaves. Select it and then hit append. Now it looks like nothing has happened, and that's simply because we need to make sure the material is applied to an object. So I'm going to Shift and D to duplicate this, hit GX2, enter, so that then we've moved another plane along this axis here. And then I'm going to go down here to my material properties panel, and instead of using matte demo, we're going to hit this drop down and look for, there it is, brown mud leaves, the one we just imported. Now we have another PBR setup all ready to go that has been imported from this other scene. And in fact, it already has displacement settings set up at 0.025, which probably means that that is our optimal displacement setting for here. So I'm going to point 0.025, and yep, that looks pretty good. Okay, so there we go. We've got 2 PBR materials in our scene ready to go. Now, learning how to use these in convincing ways takes more work and more understanding, but this will at least get you started at creating photoreal materials in your 3D scenes and your 3D projects. If you have any questions about PBR materials and how to set them up, I would be happy to answer them. Just simply leave your question in the comments below. If you have any ideas for future tutorials, ideas of topics that you would like me to cover, then be sure to leave those down below as well. We are giving away our 3Division Blender startup file that comes with that 3Division default cube. And if you'd like to get that, you can click the link in the description. Thank you for watching today. We will see you in the next one.